So, how does it feel when you play Roll Up to Win with Tim Hortons? Buy a hot or cold beverage using the Tim's app and find out. Roll in the app for a chance to win prizes ranging from free coffee and donuts to a Universal Orlando resort vacation or a sweet car. Oh, don't forget the TV. And this year, every roll is a shot at a $1,000 daily giveaway drawing for two $500 prizes. Roll up to win and get treated by Tim's. No purchase necessary. Account registration required. 50 U.S. and D.C. 18 plus entered by 4/2/23. See rules at rolluptowin.com for free entry and full details. Void in Florida and where prohibited.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
Well, from Portland.
Dan Shapir.
Hey, from Tel Aviv. Hopefully we don't lose any listeners over that.
Or
I'm Charles
panelists.
Max Wood. Yeah, no kidding, right? The last episode, you guys just disappeared on us. You know, it was like air raid sirens, we're out. And but we're glad you're safe.
Yeah, yes, we are. Thank you.
Yeah, and there is a time delay. We're like 5 or 6 episodes ahead, so people will be listening to this and going, "What?" So yeah, just go back and look at what was going on 6 weeks ago. I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that is Brian Rinaldi. Brian, do you want to say hi and remind everybody how awesome you are?
Hi, everybody. Hello from Orlando, where it's warm and sunny.
Oh, I feel your pain.
Is that pain? It sounds nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is nice, actually. It's not even, by Florida standards, it's not even hot. It's only in the 80s.
Oh, that's no nice.
So I have to ask, how often do you go to Disney World?
Well, over the past year, not that often, but but actually I just went last weekend. So it's when you live here, it's very different. Disney World always seems like just exhausting, right? Like you wake up early and you spend your whole day running to rides to maximize your ticket. And when you live here, it's like, I'll just show up in the afternoon with my season pass and just wander around for a few hours and then go home. It's not it's not a big stressful thing, you know?
So funnily enough, when my eldest son was celebrating his bar mitzvah, we actually went on this family trip to the States. And we started off with a week's stay in Disney World. And my kids, even after all these years, because it was a while back, still remember that as one of the best vacations ever. Mm-hmm. And my wife remembers it as hell on earth or something along those lines.
That sounds about right, yeah.
It does get hot enough there.
Going with kids can be exhausting. And summers here, I probably won't be back for a few months because going in the summer is just brutal.
Oh, yeah. I bet.
Yeah,
what's
my
your
mom's
community
actually
like?
going in a few weeks. So
who's going in a few weeks?
My mom is with my brother and his kids.
By then, I mean, it's surprisingly, it should be in the 90s already based on past history. So it'll be hot. Yeah. Hot and muggy. It's kind of standard.
Good deal. This episode of JavaScript Jabber is brought to you by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean recently announced their new app platform service, which is a solution to build modern cloud native apps. With App Platform, you can build, deploy, and scale apps and static websites quickly and easily. Simply point your GitHub or GitLab repository and let the App Platform do all the heavy lifting. As it has support for Node.js, Python, Go, PHP, Ruby, static sites, Docker, and container images, DigitalOcean runs their App Platform on their own infrastructure, so your costs are significantly lower than the other products. Plus, they built this new app platform on top of DigitalOcean Kubernetes, providing a smoother migration path so you can take more control of your infrastructure setup. As a listener of JavaScript Jabber, you can get started for free. Better than free, because DigitalOcean is giving you $100 credit when you go to do.co/jabber. Again, go to do.co/jabber to get your $100 free credit on DigitalOcean's new app platform. We want to thank DigitalOcean for sponsoring this episode of JavaScript Jabber. All right, well, let's talk JAMstack.
Yeah.
You should be saying the JAMstack, or am I
We be
mistaken?
jamming.
Yeah.
So now it's Bob Marley
funny.
music queued up.
So I remember like a zillion years ago, we had, what's his name? Douglas.
Rockford?
No. Now I'm going to have to go look it up. But is it Brian Douglas?
Oh, Brian Douglas. Yeah. He works at GitHub now.
Oh, yeah. He's got his own JAMstack podcast. Yeah.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. He used to work for Netlify.
Right.
And he got on and he was talking about JAMstack. And I was like, don't we do this anyway? Right? It's like, it's JavaScript and APIs and markup and that. Don't we do that anyway? Right?
Yeah.
And it's come so far and evolved so much since then. So yeah,
Well,
it's not kind of this. Yeah, it's not the simple thing anymore. What are we talking about these days when we say JAMstack?
So it's funny that you bring that up because lately my message is forget the jam, basically.
Just go with the peanut butter.
I almost said it.
Basically,
Peanut butter.
the JavaScript APIs and markup it kind of made sense back in the day. Now I feel like it just adds more confusion to the topic than it clarifies. Just to kind of go back in time, right? The term was created by Matt Billman of Netlify for a particular reason, because I had even written a book with Ray Camden a while back, like working with static sites, and everything was about static sites and static site generators, but we weren't really building static sites. I mean, these sites actually pulled in dynamic data and build time. They pulled in dynamic data on the client via JavaScript. And so like people had this misperception that what you could build with this was just like developer blogs and brochureware sites and stuff. So that it was very limited. So they came up with this term to try and change the perception of what we were building. And I think that is proven successful since then, right? I mean, it's grown enormously. But what started to happen was that the term didn't entirely make sense. I'm not advocating we drop the term, but first of all, JavaScript APIs and markup sounds like just about anything, right? Like almost every site is going to use some degree of JavaScript APIs and markup. So we have to kind of describe that differently. And secondly, JAMstack is not actually a stack either, because it's not a prescriptive set of technologies. It's a ton of different things. There's I always like to say, there's 1,000 ways you can get into the JAMstack, and you can do it using different languages and different tools and depending on which path you choose, the process can be entirely different, but it's almost like an architecture or set of methodologies that describe the similarities between those things. So even though I'm still using JAMstack, obviously as a term, I say forget the jam, and yes, it's not a stack either. So
well, look, this is the JavaScript podcast, and look at JavaScript, which has nothing to do with Java, and it's not a scripting language anymore. So you don't fight a successful brand even if it doesn't actually match the topic or the subject that it's describing.
Exactly. They always say what naming is one of the hardest problems in computer science, right? So this continues to afflict us, I guess. But the name has obviously caught on. We have a whole community kind of built around it. I'd say there are some key things to describe what it actually is. But I would preface this by saying there is still some debate, particularly this year, because things have been changing very quickly. New technologies kind of blurring the line of what's JAMstack. So some of the stuff is still open to debate in some senses, because I'll give you an example, right? So Netlify and kind of pushed by Next.js, right? Next.js had this thing called incremental static regeneration, right? Which is basically a fancy way of saying that you didn't necessarily build all your pages prior to deploying it. You built whatever pages you needed to, that are kind of your most traffic pages, and then you could somebody could hit a page that you hadn't built yet and would say, oh, I haven't built this yet. I'm going to show you a little kind of preview thing while I go off and I load the content. Then I load the content, show you the page, and from there on, everybody else after that would receive the static version of the page.
Well, that was sort of the holy grail for a long time, was incremental builds with the JAMstack side, because otherwise you're rebuilding your entire site every time you have one little change, right?
Right. So yes, and this is where we're flooded with terminology here. Incremental builds is a slightly different, because that's still happening locally, right? So that I don't have to rebuild the entire site every time. This one, it's happening when when somebody hits your site,
on demand.
the page, basically on demand page builds. So
that's sort of not JAMstack anymore. Then that's sort of back to where you were, where you're rebuilding. If you're doing a PHP site, then you're hitting your page. I got to go to my database and either get it from the cache to get it from the database or from the cache. So now we're sort of, the pendulum seems to be swinging wildly back and forth all the time.
It does blur the line because so just to kind of finish that story, like the Netlify released this distributed persistent rendering proposal, which is essentially same kind of thing. Like you hit a page, that page doesn't exist yet. We're going to go generate that page and then serve it up to you. So that sounds that's server-side rendering, except that from that point on, right, the page is actually now built, right? Like it's built, we generated it on demand that one time, but everybody else who subsequently sees that page sees the statically built version of that page, as opposed, there is not like a server-side rendering going on.
So I have to ask, and I'll explain in a second why I have to ask, but I have to ask, would you define this as JAMstack, this type of a behavior?
This type of a behavior.
Dynamic generation on demand, first time on demand. And by the way, I could even theoretically take it a step further and say that if there's an outdated version, I'll provide that on the first request, generate the updated version in the background, and serve that the next time that somebody asks for that. So I could theoretically even take it a step further. But without going into all the technicalities, this dynamic generation on first request, would that be, because I was reading the intro to your book, not exactly the intro, the chapter of what is JAMstack or what is the JAMstack. And according to the definition that was given there, this is not JAMstack.
I'll have to go back and look at my definition that I gave there, but I would say that this is JAMstack. We are still generating, basically everything is still being pre-rendered, as we like to say. In the case of, there's just certain pages are being basically on demand pre-renders. This is a solution for like super large sites, right? Like you have hundreds of thousands of pages, a build could take a long time, right? So if you have that many, most of those pages aren't necessarily trafficked all the time. So I could, if it's a page that doesn't get a lot of traffic, I don't build that at the initial build time. I build that when it gets first requested and serve that up to you. But it's still built, and that's why like the Netlify made this distributed persistent rendering proposal, because you still get the atomic builds and things like that, which means I can easily roll back and stuff like that. And so you're not losing like those kind of key benefits of the deploying a JAMstack site, while you still allow for pages to be rendered on demand. This is a one-time on-demand thing. It doesn't go back and say, oh, this is out of date, I'm going to go re-render this. You can do that. You can build that. But I would say that really starts to move towards a fully server-side rendered application, not a JAMstack application. And that's where like the whole point of this is, it is getting a little bit blurrier, those lines between what's server-side rendered and what's JAMstack starts to get a little bit blurrier than it used to be. I think for very good reasons. These are all amazing technologies that are actually going to benefit developers enormously in the long run, but it starts to blur that meaning.
So the reason that I said that this definition was so interesting for me in this particular scenario is that I actually work at Wix. And interestingly enough, while Wix is not built on any of the quote-unquote standard or JAMstack solutions or implementations that are out there, we actually utilize exactly that flow that you just described. That means that for any page that is suitable for static rendering, which is the vast majority of our pages, of the pages of the sites that are hosted on the Wix platform, we actually do exactly what you described, that it's not rendered until it's hit for the first time, but then when it is rendered, it is then pushed into the CDN, so that from that point on, it's statically served from the CDN, and it's not removed from the CDN until the site owner actually, let's say, publishes a new version of the site or changes that page or whatever.
You're basically doing exactly that. Yeah, that's exactly the proposal.
And to be fair, we were very much so. Like I said, we are not built on top of any of the standard JAMstack platforms that are out there, but we definitely were influenced, and intentionally so, by the JAMstack architecture and approach, because it's just an approach that makes so much sense in so many scenarios.
Right, and I would say, in many respects, it sounds like, obviously I don't know all the details, but it sounds like you are effectively doing a JAMstack approach, particularly if you align it with this distributed persistent rendering or incremental static regeneration stuff. Because, okay, I think in the end that my definition also includes a static site generator, but in many ways it sounds like what you've built is kind of almost like your custom static site generator. So
it's not exactly that. It's exactly that.
So, I don't, in terms of my definition, I don't personally think you have to use one of the static site generators out there. Like, you don't have to use Gatsby or Next or Hugo or whatever. Many people, we have like 470 static site generators out there because everybody likes to build their own, because it's something you can build on your own. So I think a custom static site generator that you built yourself still ends up falling under kind of the JAMstack umbrella. But I'm also personally like to define it somewhat narrowly, but I also some people say like they don't care if you use a static site generator, and I'm like, no, I think static site generator is part of the process. I think you have to deploy to a CDN, which you're doing there, right? That's part of the process. I think the the CI/CD workflow that we're used to, kind of like the Netlify Vercel workflow, where you just push it into a repo and it gets pushed up. This more or less sounds like you have something along those lines. I think those are critical pieces as well. So, like, honestly, you fit my definition of JAMstack based on what I know.
Well, there we go. Wix is JAMstack. Okay. Sweet.
Wix is JAMstack.
Ish is the term, because there are definitely pages. No, on the contrary, I'm actually one of the people who was primarily pushing towards the JAMstack approach at Wix. I'm not the only one, but I was a big proponent of it, because I come very much from a performance side of technology. My role at Wix is the performance tech lead. And one of the main benefits, again, you listed 3 benefits, which I think, or 3 or 4 benefits, of JAMstack, which I think are worth repeating. But one of them is definitely performance, because obviously serving up a static content is much faster than creating and then serving dynamic content, and also being able to serve from a CDN, which means that you're much closer to the endpoint, also results in significant performance improvements. And we've seen it, because we had changed our architecture from not being JAMstack or JAMstack-like to being as JAMstack-like as is appropriate for us. And one of those things was exactly serving content not from our servers as much as possible, but from CDN. And for example, so I'll take a very concrete example. We have a lot of customers in Australia. Our data center in the Far East is located in Japan. So if you have to go all the way to the data center, then you have to go all the way from Australia to Japan through all the relevant hops. But if you're deploying it to a CDN, well, the CDN will have its own servers or proxy servers, whatever you want to call them, in Australia. So the content is served via far fewer hops, and the result is a dramatic improvement in terms of the performance that you see.
Yeah, exactly that. So yeah, you, I guess, are doing customized JAMstack version of JAMstack that suits Wix. And I think, you know what, I also feel like while it's important, because JAMstack is more of an architecture or methodology, right, to clarify what that definition is, I don't think we need to be like so rigid. I think I've written posts about this kind of stuff. Like, for instance, using Next.js today, you could actually say, okay, most of my site is is statically generated. But I'm going to pick these routes because these couple routes actually need to be server-side rendered, and those are server-side rendered, right? And you could actually do that, even deploy it on, you could obviously deploy it on Vercel, but you can even now deploy it on Netlify, and it will work. Is that JAMstack? You now have most of the site is pre-rendered, but a couple of routes are server-side rendered. So again, blurring that line a little bit, to me that still generally qualifies as JAMstack. I mean, you have a couple of server-side rendered routes, but it's mostly pre-rendered. So that's why I kind of say, like, I like to call it static first, but not static only. Meaning, like, you're not limited to, like, okay, I have to pre-render everything and not serve up content, that I, not have that flexibility to meet the needs of more complex applications. I think if we kind of start having those debates, it gets a little silly to me.
Yeah. One thing that it's kind of struck me over the years as I've looked at JAMstack is that a lot of the focus, and you can tell me if I'm totally missing the boat here, but a lot of the focus seems to be on just simplifying your technology choices, right? So, and a lot of that just boils down to not having a back end that you have to manage, right? There's always a back end, right? There's Firebase or a GraphQL server or something, right? Something that you're hitting. That's the API part of Jam. But whether you throw out Jam or not, there's something there, right?
Yes.
And then where it's rendered or how it's rendered or all that stuff, we can argue all day about that. But yeah, but it simplifies that choice, right? Because I don't have to go write that back end. I can go use something that's out there, and then I can set up the rendering pieces, whether it's Next.js rendering it when I hit it first, or rendering it every time I hit it, or doing something else, or some of these other technologies working in a similar way, or just pulling the information out of the database and kind of doing a lot of this on the fly.
Yeah, JAMstack developers definitely favor using services, kind of like, what would you say, like basically using tools that are very specialized for certain things. So like if we're doing authorization and login, we're going to use tools like Auth0 or Netlify Identity or whatever, right? Because we generally favor not building those things yourself, where you have to. That way, you don't have the whole infrastructure in the back of the back end. That I used to develop those things years ago, and I mean, I remember building them repeatedly over and over again, and the difficulties of maintaining them, and dealing with like for authorization, dealing with all the complexities of security for something like that. And this is long before GDPR and things like it's not an easy thing to do. So we tend to favor those kind of tools for that. Like I build sites using either Auth0 or Netlify Identity for authorization, using Algolia for search, using tools like Sanity or Contentful for my content. It simplifies things in some ways, right? Because there is no backend that you're having to maintain in those cases. It complicates things in other senses because now I'm constantly kind of connecting to different APIs. And I always like to say, like, every API has a learning curve, right? So you have to kind of constantly be adding that learning curve and figuring out how I use that API, and then how do I use that API to, like, okay, now I've got your authorization, but I want to only get the content that you're authorized to see. So now I kind of have to mesh those two together. It adds a little bit of complexity.
Yeah, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it's you might say that the very existence of all these APIs is what kickstarted JAMstack in a way. I mean, if you're pulling APIs together, that's like a basic tenet of JAMstack, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. That's you're right, because before these kind of tools and services, we were doing just static sites. It really was a tool for building blogs and simple sites that really didn't have much in the way of dynamic content. And I've been doing this since 2013, and that's kind of where we were at the time. I'd say, like, back then, the extent of dynamic content was I might pull in like Discuss, which would load, basically put a widget and it would load content that was dynamic, but it really didn't wasn't a great solution. And now you have all these APIs that really turn these sites where when I wrote the first book with Ray, I had my list of things like, okay, what can you not do should you not do with the JAMstack? And it was a fairly extensive list. It was like, I would say it was easier to describe what you should do with the JAMstack than what you shouldn't, because the list was relatively small. And then for this book, it flipped. And the things you couldn't do with the JAMstack suddenly became very few things that I'd say, and even those I'm like, well, you could do it. It's just, is it worthwhile to do it in the JAMstack? Or
yeah, exactly. I was about to ask whether it's couldn't do or shouldn't do.
Yes, exactly. That becomes a question now. Whereas before it was like we couldn't do it. Now it's like, okay, you can do it. The question is like, is that the better way to solve this problem? Because while I love the JAMstack and I'm a proponent of it, it's not necessarily, not every site needs to use it. Right?
When I was thinking about it and I was trying to think to myself when I wouldn't use JAMstack, the one thing that kind of came to my mind, and I'm interested in your opinion on that, is that if the main content on the main page is highly dynamic, then it probably shouldn't be JAMstack.
Yeah,
hang on just a sec, because I have just a little bit of clarification on this point for Dan, because some of the applications that I've built, the main content on the main page is marketing copy, and so it probably will be static. But if I'm working on like an application where it's meant to be interactive in specific ways, is that what you're talking about, Dan?
Well, not necessarily. I'm thinking potentially even along the lines of something like a CNN, where the main page is full of highly dynamic breaking stories from all over that you kind of need to pull together, and it literally potentially changes like every second.
So it has to be semi-real time.
Or if it's like a stock ticker and a stock graph, or a real-time stock graph or something like that. I don't know. It could be the JAMstack. I mean, I've seen example where people just to show that they could literally build a JAMstack site that updated every second. But if the site starts getting big enough and again, and the main page is dynamic enough, it seems that it's a question of, can you do it? Well, probably you can, but should you do it? Well, no, there's a good chance that you shouldn't. That's my feeling anyway.
Okay. Yeah. I think in general, I would agree with you. I think, like you said, you could do it. If I was tackling something like, say, like a New York Times or CNN, I mean, I'd look at, there are portions of the page that change pretty often. And then there are portions of the page that change with kind of throughout the day, like maybe a few times a day. So like they'll have a headline story that sits there as a headline for quite a long time, but then they'll have like other top stories that kind of cycle in. So you might be able to do that where you dynamically generate the pieces that are going to statically generate those pieces that might remain the same without changing like minute by minute, and then pull in the other pieces. So is it possible? Yes. Would I recommend it? It depends. I mean, some of these sites, like you said, like CNN or New York Times or whatever, are changing just so constantly. You're basically in a cycle where you never stop rebuilding, which is essentially becomes a kind of, again, blurring the line between what's server-side rendered when your build process is running all the time. Are you just not server-side rendering? So, or like, for instance, if your site is primarily user-generated content can, like, you can deal with it, but are you going to see the benefits of JAMstack when I'm mostly just loading content on the client, right? And what my JAMstack site, portion, the pre-rendered part is a shell that is filled with stuff that's pulled from the client. That to me, it's like, okay, that might technically fit the definition, but you're kind of maybe not seeing the benefits because all the stuff is being pulled on the client. You might be better off going with a different architecture.
Are you ready for core web vitals? Fortunately, Raygun can help. These modern performance metrics play an important role in determining the health of your website, which is why Raygun has baked them directly into their real user monitoring tools. Now you can see your core web vital scores are trending across your entire website in real time and drill into individual pages to focus your efforts on the biggest performance gains. Unlike traditional tools, Raygun surfaces real user data, not synthetic, giving you greater insights and control. Filter your score by timeframe, browser, device, geolocation, whatever matters to you most. And what makes Raygun truly unique is the level of detail they provide so you can take action. Quickly identify and resolve front-end performance issues with full waterfall breakdowns, user session data, instance-level diagnostics of every page request, and a whole lot more. Visit Raygun.com today and take control of your core web vitals. Plans start from as little as $8 per month. That's Raygun.com for your free 14-day trial.
Yeah, and another thing that you might need to consider when you're really intermixing content coming down from the server and dynamic content that's retrieved from the client is how to do layouting, both efficiently in a way that's nice from a user experience perspective. I mean, if you need to start injecting dynamic content in between static content, you don't want things to shift all over the place. As you're loading the page or updating the page or whatever. They even have a term for it now. It's CLS. It's cumulative layout shift. It's one of the Google's core web vitals. One of the things that you need to try to minimize or mitigate.
Oh yeah, I mean, but it's something I see. It's not particular to JAMstack sites, right? Like this is something I see constantly. Speaking.
For sure.
Some of those news sites, I know on a daily basis. I'm like clicking. I tap my finger on the story I want to read, and by the time it registers that tap, the window has shifted, and I click on the wrong story.
Yeah, for more often than not, it has to do with ads, where the size of the ad is just determined at page load time, and then it shifts stuff. But what I was trying to say is you were giving the example of, let's say, a CNN homepage where you maybe bring the top story and some of the other stories, you bring them from the server, but then you need to stick in between dynamic content. Then you need to think about how to leave enough space, as it were, so that things don't need to shift around too much. Yeah, it becomes an interesting challenge. Let's put it this way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, none of these problems are simple.
I do have another question for you.
Sure.
So there's this whole concept of multi-page applications and single-page applications. Mm-hmm. When I build a JAMstack site, is it like orthogonal to that, or does it kind of necessitate one of these approaches, or is it more in line with one of these approaches?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
So my take is I do both, basically, depending on the type of site. Like, so as an example, I run this site, we do a bunch of developer events and stuff like that every couple of weeks. And that has a lot of pages, but the functionality is relatively simple. It does have like login and search and other kinds of dynamic pieces, but the functionality the UI functionality didn't require a front-end frame, in my opinion. So I didn't add one, and I use Hugo there. And that one is not a single-page application. Hugo just generates, it's more of a traditional static site generator where it's generating a bunch of pages. And all of that dynamic functionality is just plain old JavaScript that I wrote. Whereas like some of the work sites I do, we do have more complex UI functionality that would benefit from, say, React. So I use something like Next.js is usually my alternative when I have to use a front-end framework, using Next.js, and it would be a single-page application, right? So I think that was part of the confusion of the Jam, because especially the leading with the J with the JavaScript, I met so many people who tell me like, oh, well, because JAMstack, it requires like React, right? And or Vue. It's like, no, it doesn't actually. Like, in fact, tools like Hugo or Jekyll or Levity is a really popular one, even though it's JavaScript, right? It is a more traditional static site generator. They don't force a front-end framework on you. And I think both approaches are important, because a lot of, I think I'm going to make a statement that might get me in trouble. I think we over-rely on JavaScript front-end frameworks in many cases. And React, yeah. And so like, so a lot of these problems could be solved without it. And so tools like those are important to really some of those key benefits of JAMstack, because you talked about performance, but performance isn't necessarily completely baked in. You can write a JAMstack application that has way too much JavaScript going on that in the end is actually still not very the performance is pretty lousy for the client. And in fact, I know because I've done that. So not intentionally, of course, but I've done these things where it's loading a JavaScript bundle that's way too large. And so it's JAMstack, but the performance is kind of lousy. And so...
so a few questions, like follow-up questions to that. So if I'm using React, for example, on the backend, or be it Vue, whatever other JavaScript framework, and I'm using it statically, that means that I don't generate the site on demand. It's not SSR, it is static site generation. But then I'm adding the interactivity on the client side.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean that I need to hydrate the entire page in these types of scenarios? Hydrate just portions of the page? What would be the normal architecture here? And kind of related to that, if I'm doing a single page application and I need to implement the rendering logic for page number 2, 3, 4 on the client side because page navigations in SPA happen on the client side, doesn't it mean that I kind of need to duplicate the page generation logic, even though I'm maybe using React on both sides, on the server side and the client side? It's not exactly the same because here it isn't SSR exactly, it's static side generation. And on the client side, it's client side generation. And I'm kind of confused on that. So it's kind of two questions, but kind of rolled into one, I guess.
Okay, so let me tackle this. So you don't need to hydrate the whole page entirely. Mostly, if a lot of the times you're pulling content, you're only replacing out the pieces that are dynamic. But tools like, say, Next.js, which has built-in, it has the link tag, which will load that stuff. If it's pre-rendered already, it'll load it from the static files, basically. So it's not like it's going back to the server and getting this data, even though it may only replace the content piece of your page, right? So you can do both. The tools are built for doing kind of allowing you to pre-generate these things without necessarily losing the benefits of pre-rendering everything. So that would be, I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but that would be my answer, I think, if I understood your question correctly.
Well, when you're looking at hydration, then there are two aspects. One is, like you mentioned, potentially having to go back and retrieve the data.
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying, if I understand correctly, that at least some of the static site generation, Next.js, for example, can actually package the data, as it were, into the HTML itself, so that once you've got the HTML, or you also have the data, or at least a link to the data, and you don't need to do some sort of a repeat of your database query or whatever.
Right.
And the other aspect of hydration is that you're actually having to essentially kind of re-render the entire front end in the client side in order to wire up all the interactions. Now, obviously, the fact that frameworks like React have reconciliation means that you're not actually going to update the browser DOM itself. But if your virtual DOM is big enough, then even just plain old hydration can be a non-trivial computational task. So that's potentially another thing that you might want to watch out for. So if a lot of the page is actually static, and like you said, only a relatively small part of it is actually dynamic, then in an ideal world, I would somehow automatically want to hydrate only that dynamic part and treat the rest of the stuff as just static HTML received from the server, regardless of how it was rendered. Now, I'm not sufficiently familiar with the various technologies, so maybe they just do it for you and everything is flowers and daisies and whatever, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer because I don't know the inner workings of Next enough to know how it handles rehydrating smaller portions of the page. I do know, like I guess I guess I don't have a particularly good answer to that question.
That's okay.
I believe that what I've done with the tools, I'm able to basically hydrate only the portion of the page I need to, and the performance has been great. But I couldn't tell you what's going on under the covers. Particularly you think tools like I don't claim to fully understand React, to be honest, even though I use it all the time. So.
I don't think anybody does. Maybe more or less Dan Abramov, and that's it, I think.
Yeah. So it may be that you're right, and some of the tools may end up rehydrating more than you need to, or reloading portions of the DOM that don't need to be reloaded. But I can't tell you for sure.
We're kind of getting toward the end of our scheduled time. I do have one more question, though, and this is something you brought up before we got started. You mentioned that like Netlify had some new rendering tool engine thing.
The distributed persistent rendering, yeah.
Right. But I'm going to ask a more broad question and give you like 10 minutes to answer it. And that is, what big exciting things are coming with JAMstack? Because you mentioned that it's changing a lot. And so, talk about this rendering thing with Netlify, but talk about the other kind of broader things that the JAMstack nerds that are, paying attention to this area in particular are going, oh, wow, and then they see the next thing, they go, oh, wow. And then they're like, yeah, right.
Well, I think we did touch on a lot of them. I think some of the things we've seen is that particularly tools like the Gatsby's and the Next.js and Nuxt are, part of the problem with those tools was that they were particularly kind of slow at generating sites. So like if you had a simple site, it was great, but then as your site got more complex, they were slow. And I think it was Steve who mentioned about how the incremental builds. I think we've seen dramatic improvements on those tools and how fast that they build. Then there is things like incremental static regeneration or DPR, which is Netlify's distributed persistent rendering, which is like being able to render pages on demand, pre-render pages on demand, without having to build them all at once, which I think opens up JAMstack to a whole range of sites that it used to be kind of complicated for. Like, for instance, I think JAMstack is great for e-commerce. And we have a lot of really great e-commerce tools and headless e-commerce tools that make it a really good solution. But if you have a big product catalog, generating that at build time could have taken like 10, 15 minutes potentially, depending on what tool you use. And this solves that problem. And now it's like, okay, we can do this and it still works for us. So I think those things are really exciting. And you're starting to see that move into more. A lot of this was driven by Next.js, honestly. Some of those things in particular, and you're seeing that now move into other tools. Like I know I've been told that Nuxt, for instance, is going to have things like the incremental static regeneration. I don't know what they're going to call it, if it'll be distributed persistent rendering or incremental static regeneration. I don't know. It's too much terminology, honestly, but that will be coming, and there's a new version of Nuxt coming that's going to have a lot of really cool features. I've seen Zach Letterman talking about 11D Cloud, which I don't know what he's going to call it either, but it's going to have a lot of those kind of things that allow you to have the flexibility to pre-generate things initially at build time, generate things later, to start to really think about when something needs to be rendered. Does it need to be rendered right when I build it? Can it be rendered initially on demand, or does it need to be rendered on the client? Right. And I think that's one of those key things that's tough about moving into JAMstack, is thinking about, I was used to like building server side rendered applications, and it would be, well, everything is rendered when the request is made, it gets rendered on the server and sent back. But when you get into JAMstack, it's like, especially now, we're starting to say like, okay, at which stage do we need to render this part of the page or this page entirely? And it makes it a little bit more complicated, but it makes it a much more flexible solution for a much broader set of sites on the web.
From my perspective, this complication is a sign of maturity. It
Yeah.
means that you're growing to handle more diverse use cases.
Absolutely. 100% agree. I've made the same case. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting too is that, and we've seen this with a lot of these other areas of software development and with JavaScript, is that we see it kind of do this, right? So think of like the framework revolution that happened, and we had like Knockout and then Angular, and then I mean we had like a zillion of them, right?
Yeah.
And then things kind of came back around and kind of coalesced around a few ideas that really simplified things. And so it'll be interesting to see just what things we optimize for as we begin to solve some of these problems and realize, oh, there's a really elegant solution to this part of it. And now there's a really elegant solution to this piece of it. Right. And now, okay, now if we kind of put this, and this together in this framework, we come up with a really nice way to make a lot of these problems go away.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, because I think, there was a period in JavaScript I remember where it's like felt like there was a new framework every single day, and things had gotten inordinately complex, and you're like, it felt like this was going to go on indefinitely. We're going to kind of constantly having to learn new frameworks and new tools, and I think things did settle and coalesce around.
Actually, I think it's actually going on. It's just that we're not paying as much attention anymore.
Well, that's possible too. But to Charles' larger point is, I think that we're in kind of this period where things have, for JAMstack, where things have gotten a little bit complex and confusing. I will admit, I still think the benefits are worth it. But I do agree. I think we're starting to kind of coalesce around some solutions to these problems, and the tooling will continue to improve, and we will see this become a much easier solution. Particularly, I think one of the things we struggle with is helping people get started. It's a tough thing to jump into because there's not easy, obvious paths. And I think that we'll see that improve. I think the whole experience, particularly for new developers, will improve dramatically over the next year.
Yeah, that's true too. I hadn't thought as much about that, but I mean, if you're getting into front end development, yeah, you're typically going to pick up, one of three frameworks, right? Or jQuery, I guess, because it's just kind of been around forever. But yeah, you may wind up seeing the same thing with JAMstack, and not just because even within like a Next or a Gatsby or a Nuxt or what's the one for Angular, Scully, or some of these other ones that are out there that kind of take a different approach to it. There are different approaches to each of those in turn within them, depending on what you want to do. And so, yeah, a lot of that's going to coalesce too. Okay, here's kind of the basic path in, and now you can go down one of these roads depending on where you're headed.
Yeah, definitely.
Very cool. Well, if people want to, pick up your book, do you have a recommendation for that?
So the book is out through Manning. It's currently, I'm finishing. I owe 2 more chapters and then I'm done. Ray has been kind enough to actually finish his part. I'm the one who's behind. But it is available through Manning's early access program there. So basically you can get all the chapters that we've written so far are available digitally. So you can purchase that, and then you get the full book, obviously, when the full book is complete. The book itself should be out this fall. And, I also do the JAMstack newsletter, which is JAMstack.email. If people are into JAMstack and want to keep up with all of these changes and everything that's going on, that I would highly recommend subscribing to that.
Awesome. And we have a coupon code for that. I'm trying to find it. We'll make sure it winds up in the show notes. Where do people find you online if they want to just, follow you on Twitter or whatever?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at RemoteSynth, and my DMs are open, and I'm always talking, not just JAMstack, but a lot of JAMstack. I'm happy to answer people's questions on the topic or just chat about it. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. And the coupon code, by the way, is POD JSJabber 19. And guess what year we got that coupon code at? It gives you 40% off. But yeah.
Yeah. We have to get you an updated code, I guess.
Yeah. Well, if we get an updated code, I bet you'll all be able to guess what it is. Anyway.
Exactly.
Let's go ahead and do some picks. I remember working my tail off to become a senior developer. I read every book I could get my hands on. I went to any conference I could and watched the videos about the things that I thought I needed to learn. And eventually, I got that senior developer job. And then I realized that the rest of my career looked just like where I was now. I mean, where was the rush I got from learning? What was I supposed to do to keep growing? And then I found it. I got the chance to mentor some developers. I started a podcast and helped many more developers. I did screencasts and helped even more developers. I kind of became a dev hero. And now I want to help you become one too. And if you're looking forward to something more than doing the same thing at a different job 3 years from now, then join the Dev Heroes Accelerator. I'll walk you through the process of building and growing a following and finding people that you can uniquely help as you build the next stage of your career. You can learn more at devheroesaccelerator.com. Steve, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah. Let's see. So I'll start out with the usual dad jokes for the day. Thanks for the week from my good
I've been
buddy.
practicing my groan all week.
Oh, good. Be ready to pull it out. So what's the difference between a camera and a foot?
Wait.
A camera has photos while a foot has 5 toes. And then what's made of leather?
I laughed at that. I'm sorry.
What's made of leather and sounds like a sneeze? A shoe. But, for me, that brings back memories of if anybody's ever seen the Mel. Oh, my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting. Robin Hood Men in Tights. One of the great classic movies of all Mel Brooks. Yeah, there we go. He's got the scene with the rabbi who goes around giving circumcisions 2 for 1. But there's a scene, Dave Chappelle's in there, and his name is Sneeze, and his dad's name is Shoe. And so they play off that pun quite a bit too. So
I have to say that my favorite Mel Brooks movie by far, there are a couple. I mean, I love Blazing Saddles and Spaceballs is obviously great, but my favorite
you passed
by
over
far,
Spaceballs?
No, I said Blazing Saddles and Spaceballs.
I know, but it's not your favorite.
No, my
Blazing
favorite
Saddles.
is The Producers.
That's one I've never seen.
The original one.
I haven't seen it.
Not the remake.
Yeah,
I will admit I haven't seen that one either. My favorite would have been Blazing Saddles. But I haven't seen them all.
Well, there's this one. What's funny is that my
favorite is Spaceballs.
My kids' school, they have a thing that they do at 1 week during the year called Candygrams, where you can, buy a little candy thing and little Instagram. So, of course, the first thing that comes to my mind every time I hear that is Candygram for Mongo. Candygram for Mongo.
Yeah.
And
but there's also the Crazy History of the World, and there are
History of the World Part 1. Yeah,
there are a couple of great ones, but for me, it has to be The Producers. And if you haven't seen it, then you owe it to yourselves. And again, I'm talking about the original one with Gene Wilder.
I'll definitely have to go see that.
Yeah,
I do love some Mel Brooks.
Well, Gene Wilder is amazing. Anyway,
so that's all I got.
Derailed Steve.
Oh no! I just think of it as an enhanced discussion more than anything. So
awesome. All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Well, I came in with essentially no picks, but I was kind of saved by the bell by Brian himself, because in preparation for our conversation today, I was actually, looking through the background material, and I got to the Manning site, and I read the chapter in his book, in the upcoming book, about why JAMstack. So first thing I learned that I'm spelling JAMstack wrong. So thanks for that. Well, not spelling, capitalizing, I think would be the better term. So I learned that you're not supposed to capitalize the A and the M anymore. So I definitely learned something. And I still don't know if I should be saying JAMstack or the JAMstack, by the way. So which is it?
I'll have to address that. I usually say the JAMstack, but I don't think there's a canonical way of saying that.
So anyway, like I said in our conversation before the show, I really enjoyed reading.
Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/post. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience. and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. At ZipRecruiter.com/post. That's ZipRecruiter.com/post. ZipRecruiter.com/post.
Without the ones like you, who work tirelessly to keep things running, everything would suddenly stop. Hospitals, factories, schools, and power plants, they all depend on you. No matter the weather, emergency, or time of day, you're the ones who get it done. At Grainger, we're here for you with professional-grade industrial supplies. Count on real-time product availability and fast delivery. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.